Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa and welcome to Kaladesh Limited Review Week on my channel. Every time a new set comes out, I post a limited review video every day from the day it is spoiled until the pre-release, and in these videos I talk about my initial impressions about the format. So far this week, I've covered the best colorless commons and uncommons, as well as the best commons and uncommons in each color. Today we're looking at the archetypes in Kaladesh. In this video I'll talk about what seems to be the archetype for each color pair based on the various synergies that exist among the cards in the various colors. I will talk about commons and uncommons that fit into each archetype and discuss how viable I think each archetype is. I should note that generally I don't talk about cards that are just powerful in every archetype that happens to have the color of that particular card in this video, like removal spells, unless they have a special kind of synergy with the archetype I'm discussing. If you just want to see what the best commons and uncommons are in each color, I do have other videos for that, and you can find them in an annotation on this video. This video, by the way, is exceptionally long, as we're covering 10 different color pairs and talking about at least 100 cards probably. So there should be timestamps for each archetype in the description below. Without further ado, let's get started. Something Wizards has been doing lately is including what they call signpost uncommons. These uncommons are included as a way of sort of nudging a color pair in a certain direction that is synergistic for that color pair. And they're doing that in this set. And for each of these color pairs, we're going to be looking at the signpost uncommon, discussing what it tells us, and then seeing if what the signpost uncommon indicates is a practical archetype. So Engineered Might here is a cool card. It can either just pump one creature by a lot, or I think what you want to be doing more frequently is pumping all of your creatures by +2/+2 and giving them vigilance. This is because green and white are particularly adept at making servo tokens. This is because green and white is one of the color pairs where both colors have cards with Fabricate. And so that's a reason for this deck to be the go wide token deck. So let's talk about the various ways green-white can make tokens. The primary way is with Fabricate. You have cards like Glint Sleeve Artisan, who is a 3-mana 2/2, and you can choose to either make him a 3/3 with a +1/+1 counter on him, or put a servo into play. And I'll say right now that most of the time, if you're in the green-white deck and you've gotten there with it, you want to be creating the servo token. You want to be getting 2 bodies for every 1 card you play as much as you can before you play a card like Engineered Might that just wins you the game. So that's what you want to be doing with Fabricate creatures. Other Fabricate creatures are like Propeller Pioneer. Again, 2 bodies, 1 card. It also has an evasive body, which is nice when you pump your whole team. A card that doesn't actually have Fabricate but makes more servo tokens, and it's 2 bodies for 1 card, is Servo Exhibition. 3 bodies for 1 card is even better. Visionary Augmenter is a very good card. I mentioned it as one of the best uncommons in white in my other limited review videos, and it's incredibly good in this particular deck. And again, 3 bodies, 1 card is good. Elegant Edgecrafters gives you that, in addition to having an evasive ability of its own. A card with Fabricate that's probably the worst card with Fabricate for this deck is Highspire Artisan. It does give you 2 bodies for 1 card, but it seems more like a defensive card than it does an aggressive one. The Artisan has 0 power. Yes, when you pump him, he'll get bigger, but he's going to hit for way less than any other. Like every other creature with Fabricate in this particular archetype has at least 2 power. So Highspire Artisan doesn't, and that's kind of bad, but it's still okay because it's 2 bodies, 1 card. Pima Outrider is great because it's 2 bodies for 1 card, and it has trample, so when you pump your whole team, that's even better. Cogworker's Puzzle Knot does not have Fabricate, but it's again 2 bodies for 1 card, and there's servo tokens. So it's not an amazing card in general, but in this deck, I think you're happy to run it unless you just got like multiples of every single card with Fabricate. Whirler Maker isn't a card I'm in love with. I'm not convinced it's actually going to be good enough for this deck, but I include it here because if it's for any deck, it's for this one, because you can get a lot more than 2 bodies for 1 card out of Whirler Maker, though you have to have a massive mana investment to do it, so it's a little clunky. Iron League Steed is a reasonably costed artifact creature with Fabricate 1, and again, 2 bodies for 1 creature, and it has haste, which is sometimes relevant, though less relevant in this particular deck, which tries to just like mass forces and then run over your opponent. So what are the ways you can pump your whole team in this format? Well, there's really only one that's common, unfortunately, and that is Inspired Charge. The good news is Inspired Charge is bad in basically every single other deck in the format, so if this deck is open, you're going to be getting Inspired Charges. You could probably get 3 of them if you want, and that might be what you want if you can really go wide enough with this deck. And it's very good for this deck, like I said, bad for everyone else. It's great, too, because it's an instant. And that allows you to sort of surprise your opponent by suddenly killing them. Engineered Might is only a sorcery, but it's another card that pumps your whole team, but it's uncommon. Another uncommon that can pump your whole team, and it actually does it permanently, is Durable Handicraft. It does cost 6 mana to do that, but you can also just make your creatures bigger in the meantime, so it's not like it doesn't do something else on the way. And another very good card for this deck is Chief of the Foundry. Pumps all your servo tokens, your Thopters too, if you happen to have some of those. And that's a pretty good effect. So I think this is the best deck for Chief of the Foundry. So those are the ways you have to pump all your creatures. Inspired Charge is a crucial card for this deck. So if you don't get it, or some of the rares we're about to talk about as well, it's harder for this deck to succeed, although going wide can be a successful strategy in general if you just keep swinging at your opponent. But Inspired Charge is crucial. It's a crucial key common for the deck. Let's look at some rares that support this deck quite effectively. Master Trinketeer pumps all your servos and Thopters, so he's the kind of rare you want for this deck, and he can make servos on his own. Cultivator of Blades can give you 3 bodies for 1 card, which is sometimes what you want to do if you don't feel like you've gone wide enough yet and you're holding on to your Inspired Charge. But if you've already got a bunch of servo tokens in play, you can also just make this guy a 3/3. This is the one exception to the rule where I said you don't usually want to be putting the counters on your guy. Cultivator of Blades you do, because when it swings, it'll give +3/+3 to your whole team instead of just +1/+1. Ovia Pashiri makes you servo tokens and then can make large tokens with power and toughness equal to the number of creatures you control. And Angel of Invention is obviously amazing in any deck that there ever was, but Angel of Invention is probably at its best in this deck because it has Fabricate, so it's 3 bodies in 1 card, it pumps all your creatures, and it has Flying, Vigilance, and Lifelink. So can't really go wrong there. So that's a green-white deck. It's all about Fabricate, but it's about making servo tokens with Fabricate. I mention that specifically because we're moving now to an archetype that's also about Fabricate, but it's about putting +1/+1 counters on your creatures with Fabricate. And that is the green-black deck. Our signpost uncommon here is Hazardous Conditions. It's a card I like quite a bit. It basically encourages you to play creatures that have +1/+1 counters on them one way or another. And the reason I like this card is because it can create scenarios where if all your creatures or several of your creatures have +1/+1 counters on them, you can cast Hazardous Conditions, kill a couple of your opponent's creatures, and the rest, chances are, aren't going to be able to block your guys effectively, and that's a pretty big blowout. So let's go ahead and look at the various ways you can, various creatures that put +1/+1 counters on themselves. Or the various payoffs, actually, is what we're going to look at. We're going to look at the various payoffs, other payoffs for +1/+1 counters. One of them is Aetherborn Marauder, a 4 mana 2/2 with Flying and Lifelink. Already a decently playable card in basically any deck with those stats, but if you have +1/+1 counters on your guy, you can move any number of them to your Marauder. So just moving 1 to the guy is a huge difference. 2 is a frightening thing. So he encourages you to have +1/+1 counters on your guy. Another card that pays you off, a green uncommon that pays you off for them, is a card that draws you a card every time when it comes into play for each creature you have with a +1/+1 counter on it, is what I mean. And that's a pretty good effect. Drawing like 2 or 3 cards when you play it is a good deal, and you could even be drawing even more. And another uncommon that pays you off for it is Fairgrounds Trumpeter, who's a 3 mana 2/2, not usually what you want to be paying, but anytime you put +1/+1 counters on other permanents, it also gets one at your end step. So that's pretty good. The bad news is you only get to do it once, so it would only become a 3/3 if you put 2 +1/+1 counters on things, but usually you're not going to be doing multiple a turn, so it'll get progressively bigger. Now, the bad news is all 4 of the payoffs for green and black +1/+1 counters are uncommon, but the good news is nobody wants Armorcraft Judge or Fairgrounds Trumpeter unless they're in this deck. So if you're seeing those are a clear sign that the deck is open, and they're very powerful in this deck while they're medium or worse in every other deck. So let's look at some other ways you can get +1/+1 counters on your creature for these payoffs to actually matter. So as I mentioned, Fabricate is a key thing. Black and green and black and white and green and white are both color pairs that have a bunch of Fabricate, and you can, with them together, decide whether you want to be putting a +1/+1 counter on your guy, and in this one, that's what you want to be doing instead of making a servo token. So Ambitious Aetherborn, for example, is a 5 mana 5/4 with a +1/+1 counter on it, a reasonable rate for the body, and your deck actually should care about +1/+1 counters. Maulfist Squad, you're usually going to want to be a 4 mana 4/2, and one of those with Menace is actually pretty well menacing, so that's a good thing to have. There's Weaponcraft Enthusiast, who is a 3-mana 2/3 if you put the +1/+1 counters on him. I do think in his case, usually, most of the time, he's probably better to put the servos into play. But in this deck, if you have a lot of +1/+1 counter payoffs, I think you should be putting them on him. Pima Outrider is an interesting card because it's probably actually better most of the time when you put the +1/+1 counter on it, because a 4/4 Trampler is a force to be reckoned with on turn 4. So you'll be doing that with that card usually anyway. And then there's also Elegant Edgecrafters again, who we met earlier. Now you probably want to be making it a 5/6 who's difficult to block, not a bad rate. Here you want to be making High Spire Artisan a 1/4 with reach, and I think that's a little better. It's better in this deck than it is in the green-white deck. And there's also Fretwork Colony, who just puts +1/+1 counters on itself every turn and progressively gets larger. There's Lawless Broker, who when it dies puts a counter on something. There's Subtle Strike, which can be a removal spell for an X1 and put a counter on something, or a combat trick. There is Thriving Rats, which gets a +1/+1 counter on it when you attack if you spend energy. There's Durable Handicraft, and it's better in this deck than it is in the green-white one, because you want all these +1/+1 counters, and you can put them on early, and you can put them on all your creatures late. Hunt the Weak is a good removal spell in general, but in this deck it's extra good because of the +1/+1 counter. Kujar Seed Sculptor is good because it puts a +1/+1 counter on something. That means worst case scenario, it's a 2-mana 2/3, which is actually a pretty good deal. Then there is also Longtusk Cub, who's a 2-mana 2/2, who can spend energy to put counters on himself. And there's also Thriving Rhino, who's a 3-mana 2/3, who can spend energy to put counters on himself. So there's a lot of ways to put +1/+1 counters on your guys. There's 4 uncommon payoffs for it, and you have to get some of those for the deck to really work. There are also some rares that pay you off for doing it, or are good in this deck because they have counters on them. For example, Bristling Hydra is just a good card in general, but it gets counters in this deck, and counters are extra important. Cultivator of Blades is good, period, but again, we want the counters, usually even in the green-white deck, so here it might even be better. Verdurous Gearhulk is just a great card in general, but distributing your counters is nice. And Animation Module pays you off for putting +1/+1 counters on things. It's a rare payoff for doing so. So that's a green-black deck, and as I said, you do have to get uncommons for it to work, but the uncommons, most of them aren't in high demand, so I think you can get them and make the deck work. Now, we're going to talk about something a little different in the set that we haven't seen for a while, and that is the fact that I think there's actually a viable 3-color deck that can be drafted here. You noticed with both the decks, they're all about Fabricate. Green-white's about Fabricate going wide, and black-green is about +1/+1 counters. Well, you can combine both together, and whichever sort of payoff you have more of, whether it's the counters or going wide, you can decide to do that with your creatures with Fabricate, and that's a really big deal. It's going to be a more powerful deck if you can swing putting all 3 colors in it, because of the fact that you'll have way more creatures with Fabricate than you would have otherwise. And the good news is, because Abzan is a color that happens to have green in it, a shard rather that happens to have green in it, you can actually splash relatively easily. You have 2 commons that help you. Attune with Ether isn't amazing, but it does give you energy, which is relevant in this format, and it can search you the land you need. Wild Wanderer I actually like quite a bit. It ramps you while also getting you the land you need. Servant of the Conduit produces energy and then can use it to make mana of any color. So those are 3 commons and uncommons. Two are just common that can really help this deck splash and make Abzan a real possibility. There's also an artifact in Prophetic Prism that helps you splash. And there's also a land in Ether Hub that can help you splash. Worth noting that there are no common dual-colored lands in this format, so splashing is harder than usual. But if you're green, it's not so hard, is what I'm trying to say. So I think this shard is a real possibility. You can also if you can't get the fixing, you can also end up just being black-green or green-white, and those are fine decks too. But it's definitely going to be stronger when you can swing all 3 colors together. So let's move on to our next archetype, which is red-green. In red-green, our signpost uncommon is Voltaic Brawler, a hyper-aggressive 2-mana 3/2 who makes energy when he comes into play, and whenever he attacks, you can pay 1, and he gets +1/+1 and trample. So first couple times he attacks, if you have no other energy in your deck, he'll be a 4/3 trampler the first 2 swings, and that's a pretty great deal. We again are going to have a shard here that's based on energy, but each of the energy decks is a little bit different, and the red-green energy deck is the most aggressive of them all. It focuses on, as Voltaic Brawler is showing you here, on using the energy to make your creatures stronger and to just bash your opponent's face as hard as you can. It's also not the best color pair at making energy, but there's lots of creatures who have self-contained energy they make that they can then use to make themselves bigger. So let's look what I'm talking about here. And we'll look at red and green commons that have aggressive effects that they use with energy. The first of these is Maulfist Doorbuster, who is a nice card. He gives you 2 energy when he comes into play. And then when he attacks, you can do the old Goblin Heel Cutter thing and make something unable to block, which is a very nice thing to do. Only something you really want to be doing in an aggressive deck. It's not as good in a non-aggressive deck. You also have Spontaneous Artist, who's a 4-mana dude who gives you an energy, and you can pay that energy to give haste to something. Not as exciting as a Doorbuster, but a fine card nonetheless. There's also Thriving Grubs, a 2-mana 2/1, who can use energy to make itself bigger permanently with +1/+1 counters. And there's, of course, also Thriving Rhino, a 3-mana 2/3, who can make itself permanently bigger with +1/+1 counter when it spends energy. I don't think it's a coincidence, by the way, that the red and green Thriving cards are the best of the cycle. It's because this deck is supposed to be an archetype. There's also Long Tusk Cub, who makes energy when it hits stuff and then puts counters on itself. There's Riparian Tiger, 5-mana 4/4, who gives you some energy, and then it can use that energy to get +2/+2. It already has Trample. So there's several commons you're seeing here that are very good with energy. Thriving Grubs, Thriving Rhino, and Riparian Tiger. And there's a couple of uncommons that are nice aggressive creatures that are all about energy in Maulfist, Doorbuster, and Long Tusk Cub. So this is the kind of thing you want to be doing the most with red and green. There's also a few other cards in red and green, and there's also a colorless card that allow you to produce energy. But like I said, this color pair is not the best at producing it, but it does have a few cards that help you. One of these is Sage of Shayla's Claim, just a 2-mana 2/1, gives you 3 energy. Another is Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot, who can give you up to 6 energy, which is very relevant. And Fabrication Module is very nice because when you get energy, you can make your creatures bigger, and your deck is aggressive, so you want to be doing that. And you can also just use it to make energy and make a creature bigger. Both things you want to be doing in this deck. So Fabrication Module definitely at its best in this particular deck. Let's take a look at some of the rares that fit well into this strategy. We have Architect of the Untamed. Helps you get a bunch of energy, which means that you can start pumping it into your creatures or save it up to create a beast token. New Hellions definitely at its best here. This is an aggressive deck, playing a turn 3 4/4 with haste that can probably only swing twice before it gets sacrificed is exactly what this deck wants to be doing. Territorial Gorger is great in this deck because basically, every creature in your deck that comes into play, several of them anyway, will produce energy and pump the Gorger up to at least a 2/2. We also have a card we've seen before in Bristling Hydra. He likes energy to make himself protected with hexproof and give him a counter. And there's also Multiform Wonder, who's at its best here because he's a very aggressive creature. Like the idea of paying 2 energy, 2 energy to give him lifelink and flying, and then 1 more to make him hit for 5 is a pretty big swing and pretty great. So that is the red-green energy deck. We're now going to jump into another color that is energy-based, another color pair that is energy-based. And that color pair is blue-red. Blue-red also cares about energy, but it uses it differently than red-green, as Whirler Virtuoso can show us. The Virtuoso uses energy to make 1/1 Thopters, something slow compared to what the red-green deck wants to be doing with energy. Instead of using up energy quickly, this deck looks to stockpile it to use on small incremental advantages, like making Thopters, and aims to win a longer game than the red-green deck. Let's take a look at what I mean. So for example, we have Aether Theorist. Comes into play, makes you some energy, and it can scry. Again, the red-green deck kind of turns its nose up at that effect. It doesn't really want to be doing that. It wants to be turning cards sideways and spending energy to kill things right away. But Aether Theorist gets 3 triggers off of the energy it produces once. When it comes into play. And that's a pretty good deal. Scrying is a small incremental advantage that matters very little to an aggressive deck, but to a more mid-range or control deck, this is exactly the kind of thing you want to be doing, especially on a decent 1/3 body that can block a lot of creatures that come down around the same time. There's also Era of Innovation, a card that's actually an energy engine. Whenever you play an artifact or an artificer, you can pay 1 and give it 2 energy, and then when you get to 6 energy, you can draw 3 cards, and that's another thing control decks want to be doing. There are artificers in this color pair, of course, and so that makes it a little better, and of course, every deck's going to have artifacts in it in this format, so it's not going to be hard to produce some energy with the card in general. John Jeet Sentry, another card that sort of reflects this different strategy. a 3-mana 2/3 that gives you 2 energy tokens and then can, master decoy things down, but it also can untap things. So it's got a powerful effect that's good at like slowing your opponent down, locking down your opponent's best creature, especially if you're continuing to make energy for the Janjit Sentry to use. And again, not what you want to be doing in a more aggressive deck for the most part. There's also Minister of Inquiries. I'm not sure how I feel about him. I guess if you get an energy engine going, he's actually a pretty quick way to mill someone. He mills 3 cards for every energy, and he makes 2 on his own. So he is a potential sort of build around in this format. If you really end up with Era of Innovation, a bunch of Artificers, and Ministers of Inquiries, you can just win the game by milling people. There is also High Tide Hermit, who gives you 4 energy when he comes into play, and he's a decent blocker in the meantime. But on top of that, you can make him into an attacker. I think a lot of the times, though, you're playing him for the 4/4 body that also gives you energy, and then you can use it on cards like your Aether Theorist or your Janjit Sentry to get you to the later part of the game. There's also one red card that I think is better suited to this deck than to the other one, although obviously all the red energy cards we mentioned in the last archetype also can fit into this deck, but most of them are a little more aggressive, so it's not going to be quite as aggressive of a deck as red-green. But Aether Torch Renegade is best in here. Gives you 4 energy when he comes into play, and then he can just start pinging things and killing them, and then he can also hit players if you get to enough energy. So he's obviously at his best in this deck, whereas in the other deck he would kind of be sitting around and probably not even getting to use his energy. That's the one thing he would be included for in the other deck, in the red-green deck, is when you play the Renegade, you get 4 energy, and suddenly you can make all your creatures even bigger. And then, maybe later you might ping something, but probably not. So let's look at some of the ways that blue and red has to produce energy on card. It has ways to produce energy on cards that don't actually use energy. Something red-green mostly doesn't have, other than its Puzzle Knot. Blue has the Glassblower's Puzzle Knot, which scries, which is nice. It's an effect that this deck is kind of obsessed with. But so far, there's not a payoff for it. It'll be interesting to see if in Aether Revolt there's a scry deck. There seems to be a lot of scry in this set, so it'd be interesting to see. But anyway, Glassblower's Puzzle Knot scries for you, and it gives you energy. Glimmer of Genius draws you cards and gives you energy and lets you scry, all things that a control deck wants to be doing. Aether Meltdown is a removal spell that gives you energy that you can use on something else. Let's talk about some of the cards that are going to be good in this particular deck, the rares that is. I love Aether Squall Ancient in this deck. He's just an energy engine on his own. You can use it on various effects you want to while killing your opponent in the air, or you can just bounce all other creatures to their owner's hands if you want to. Confiscation Coup is a good card in any deck, but if you have lots of energy, you can use it to steal basically anything in the format. We have Lot New Hellion again. I don't think he's at his best in this deck, but I don't think he hurts either. A lot of times your opponent's just going to have to trade a card or two to get to not take, or they just take 8 damage. That's the deal they're left with. Territorial Gorger is pretty good in this deck, though, because you could end up with multiple effects a turn gaining you energy, and then it gets to be a pretty big attack. So both blue-red and red-green care about energy, and they do things a little differently with it. Blue-red is a little more about control, a little more about incremental advantages, and red-green is about winning as quickly as possible. There's also one other color pair that's interested in energy, and that is blue-green. The blue-green card that is our signpost uncommon is Imperial Voyager, a 3-mana 2/3 with flying and trample, which is a good rate already, and when he deals combat damage to a player, you get that much energy, so 2 if he hits a player without any boost, so that's pretty good. He's an energy engine of sorts on his own, and what this reflects, I think, is that this deck sort of has the best of both other decks. Maybe not the best, but has elements of both other decks. It lacks red, so it's missing some of the aggression that the deck needs, that the other decks have, that is. An Imperial Voyager instead is a card that's just like a really efficiently costed spell. It still gets the green monsters that like to eat energy and get really big, and he can give them energy when he does his combat damage. So the blue-green deck is sort of in between the two. It has green aggressive creatures, but it also has blue cards that can give you an incremental advantage. It's more of a mid-range deck, as Imperial Voyager can tell us. And there's one advantage that this color pair has over the other energy decks, and that is that both of its spell knots in these colors produce energy. And this is possibly one of the most efficient ways to produce energy in the format. I mean, Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot is a card that on its own gives you 6 energy. Glassblowers gives you 4, but that's a pretty good deal. I mean, it gives you a lot of energy. We're not going to talk about the other cards that go well into this deck. We've already talked about all the cards that care about energy in every single in the other colors. just know that it's a little bit different than the other two. You just take the best energy cards that are blue and the best ones that are green and stick them together and hopefully get a few puzzle knots, or at least one of each would probably be pretty good for this deck. But, as you may suspect, once again, I think we're given here the opportunity to, instead of just doing a 2-color archetype, we can actually do a 3-color archetype. Again, we can do a shard, we can do Temur. This is because, again, green has the capability of helping it, of fixing, so doing a 3-color deck that has green in it isn't hard. What's more, I think Temur is the deck that's best set up of the 3-color decks we're going to talk about. There are actually 3 possible 3-color decks in this format. This is the second one we've talked about, but it's the best setup of all of the 3-color decks in the format to make use of the fixing. This is because Attune with Ether gives you energy. The Abzan deck, while it might have a few cards that use energy, it's not going to have a lot of them. This deck is going to have a lot. It's what the deck is basically built around. Servant of the Conduit uses energy to produce mana of any color. You're going to have energy lying around to use in addition to the energy she produces. Wild Wanderer is the same in both decks, but another card, Ether Hub, will also be better in this deck. You can either use the energy or you can use the energy to produce mana of any color. And the other thing that this deck has that the Abzan deck doesn't is cards that scry, which you mentioned earlier. Scrying, while it's not perfect fixing, is one way you can sort of look at mana fixing, because it can help you get to the cards you need, whether it's the fixing you need, whether you need to hit your Wild Wanderer, or whether it's just the land you need in general. So Ether Theorist can help you with that, as can Glimmer of Genius, as can Glassblower's Puzzle Knot. So this is the deck that I think will be the most consistently possible of the 3-color decks. And you want to be doing the 3-color deck if you possibly can, I think, because you can produce just so much more energy. If you're all 3 colors, you can do so many different things with energy that your deck will just be really strong. Your deck could even be a mostly aggressive deck, but by splashing blue, you get to include a few cards that produce energy in blue, like Glimmer of Genius or things like that. And that's not a bad thing to do. I mean, if you're just splashing, this deck can really splash one of the colors and be pretty good. So that's the second sort of shard we're going to talk about. We're now going to move on to actually the beginnings of a third shard by talking about another 2-color pair, and that is Black-Red. Black-Red is a deck that's going to care about artifacts. There are many color pairs in this set that care somewhat about artifacts, but there's really only 2 that really care about artifacts, let's say, where their signpost uncommon indicates they care about artifacts, and they have several cards that care about artifacts. So the first of these is Black-Red, who is given Unlicensed Disintegration as their signpost uncommon. For 3 mana, you can kill something, and you do 3 damage to something if you control an artifact. So basically, it is a better murder with upside. And I think this, of all the signposts and commons we're going to look at, is the one I feel the most comfortable first picking, at least from a mediocre pack, because of the fact that it's just so powerful. It can just do so much damage and so much action. It kills something while doing damage, and that's just really good. Unconditional removal is always really good. So let's look at what the black and red cards are that care about artifacts, and then we'll discuss exactly what the identity is of the black-red artifact deck. So first card we're going to talk about is Built to Smash. It gives an attacking creature +3/+3, and if it's an artifact, that creature also gets trample. So that's a nice little bonus you get for having artifact creatures, something to keep in mind. We also have Inventor's Apprentice, who becomes a 2/3 if you control an artifact. I think it's got a better future in Constructed than it does in Limited, but it's an okay card. I mean, a 2/3 can actually block reasonably well, sometimes even in the latter part of the game. But it's not incredible, but it is, it is a card that cares about artifacts. Incendiary Sabotage cares about artifacts, and you can also use it, and it does 3 damage to everything if you sacrifice an artifact. Quicksmith Genius lets you loot every time you play an artifact. Not something you mind doing, certainly. Reckless Fireweaver is pretty sweet. Every time you play an artifact, it does 1 damage to your opponent. So it's kind of a win condition. It can give you some reach. Salivating Gremlins gets bigger and gains trample every time you play an artifact. Welding Sparks is a card that's good in any red deck, but it's at its best here, where you can sometimes use it to kill like a 6/6 or something like that. Dunned Operative gets +1/+0 and Death Touch if you control an artifact, so 3/2 with Death Touch, pretty legit. Embrawl Bruiser gains Menace if you control an artifact, enters the battlefield tapped as well. Foundry Screecher gets +1/+0 as long as you control an artifact. Oval Chase Daredevil can come back from your graveyard to your hand every time you play an artifact. Tidy Conclusion, another card that's just good in any black deck, but it's going to gain you some life sometimes in this deck. Underhanded Designs is a card that cares about artifacts two separate ways. First of all, you can use it to drain your opponent. Second of all, you can use it as a kill spell if you control two artifacts. So what do these cards mostly have in common? I would say that they're mostly aggressive creatures. They're creatures that if you control artifacts, get way better. Basically, this deck wants to kill the opponent by having all of this artifact synergy, just by pumping your Foundry Screechers, giving your Embrawl Bruisers Menace, letting your Reckless Fire Weaver hit your opponent, and that's what this deck mostly wants to be doing. It wants to just be attacking and killing the opponent thanks to the artifact bonuses that the deck can gain. And that's something I think this deck is very capable of. Artifacts are an easy thing to get your hands on in this format. And these cards are all just get better when you have artifacts, and most of them are playable anyway. But they get way better when you have artifacts, and that's a really great place to be in an artifact set. Because of the fact that this deck really wants artifacts but is also aggressive, I think that this is the best deck for aggressively costed artifact creatures who both fulfill the artifact requirement and are creatures that can continue to beat down your opponent. So let's look at some of the cards I'm talking about. We have Chief of the Foundry. I do think it's better in the green-white deck or in the Abzan deck, potentially. But it's fine here. You're going to be running other artifact creatures, and he fulfills an artifact requirement. Eager Construct lets you and your opponent both scry, but it's a 2-mana 2/2, and this deck needs artifacts on the lower curve. Foundry Inspector is going to be good in this deck because it makes your artifact spells cost less, and you're going to be running a lot of them. Prakata Pillar Bug is just a 3-mana 2/3, but you can pay 1 black to give it lifelink. Not a bad deal. Snare Thopter, a nice, very aggressively costed creature, 4-mana 3/2 with flying and haste. And there is also Weld Fast Monitor, who you can give Menace, so you can sort of turn it into a Boggart Brute, which is a pretty good deal, I think. Obviously, basically any artifacts are good in this deck, especially like your Spell Knots. Artifacts that you're going to just leave in play are good in this deck. Prophetic Prism, for example, are all good in this deck, because if you just get one artifact in play, it turns on about 80% of the cards that care about them. Only a few of them ask for more than one artifact. So let's talk about some of the rares that care about artifacts. We've got Marionette Master, who has Fabricate, but I think is actually at its best in this deck because you're going to be running a lot of artifacts. So you can choose to put some servos into play if you need some artifacts, which, by the way, in general, Fabricate is solid in this deck because it gives you artifacts to turn on your pseudo metalcraft abilities. If you have one artifact, a creature gets a bonus. Fabricate isn't bad at turning that on. But Marionette Master, you can, I think making it into a 4/6 is potentially pretty good in this deck because of the fact that your opponent's going to have a hard time blocking artifact creatures. When artifacts go into the graveyard, they're going to lose life. Syndicate Trafficker is also pretty sweet. It eats artifacts. It plus Marionette Master is a pretty good deal, right? And it puts a +1/+1 counter on it and gains indestructible when it eats the artifacts. And then there's Pia Nalar. This is the best deck for her. She gives you a Thopter token, and she can pump artifact creatures, and she can sack artifacts to make a creature unable to block. So that does it for black-red, but as I said, there's one other color pair that cares about artifacts, and that is blue-black. The blue-black artifacts deck has as its signpost uncommon Contraband Kingpin, a 2-mana 1/4 with lifelink, and he lets you scry whenever a artifact enters the battlefield under your control. So again, we're seeing sort of a difference between two different archetypes that both care about the same thing. We saw this with energy, and now we're seeing it with artifacts. The blue-black archetype is a little more controlling, a little more about getting this, getting your scry on, finding your removal, finding your bomb to win you the game. Whereas the black-red deck was more about just attacking and killing your opponent with creatures who are increasingly powerful if you control an artifact. So let's look at the blue cards that care about artifacts. We already looked at all the black ones that do. Many of them go into this deck as well. But let's look at the blue ones to see what blue brings to the table in place of red. So what blue has is Era of Innovation, an artifact payoff. It's also good in the energy decks, but it's one of the few sort of like energy producing cards that I think is also well suited to just a deck that cares mostly about artifacts. Era of Innovation lets you produce energy when you play artifacts, and you can eventually draw cards with it. Artificers also, so that's a thing. Gear Seeker Serpent, I think, is a super good common. Like, if you're getting there on this deck, you're the only person who wants Gear Seeker Serpent, so it's easy to get one or two of them. You may not want more than one, but the fact that it has affinity for artifacts is actually pretty strong. I mean, even if you just reduce its cost to 5, which isn't going to be very hard to do, especially if you have servo tokens from your black creatures, Gearseeker Serpent becomes a pretty crazy thing to play. Just turn 4, turn 5, Gearseeker Serpent. By the way, sometimes it's unblockable. It's probably the best common finisher creature in the format. The ruin processor of this format, if you will, if you played during Oath of the Gatewatch. Glintnest Crane cares about artifacts, but in another sort of controlling way. It's a 2-mana 1/3 flyer, pretty control type body, not an aggro body, and it lets you draw an artifact from your deck if one is in the top 4 cards of your library. You also have Shrewd Negotiation, another card that works well with servo tokens. You can steal your opponent's best creature or steal your opponent's best artifact just by giving up whatever your worst artifact is, whether it's like your Spell Knot that you don't really care about anymore, your Prophetic Prism, or a servo token, which is probably the most ideal thing to do to someone. And that's another reason why this goes well with the servo token generating cards, because of cards like Shrewd Negotiation and Gearseeker Serpent really like them. There's also Tezzeret's Ambition. It's not the most exciting of artifact payoffs, but it's another indicator of how controlling the deck is. The fact that it's a sorcery really hurts it, though. I don't know how much play it'll see. It'll see play in decks that really have a ton of removal, I think, but not outside of that. And then there is also Weldfast Wingsmith, who's, gains flying every time you play an artifact. So we're seeing a very different identity here from the red-black deck. The black-blue deck is more about control. Its creatures are a little slower, or they're a little less aggressively, have less aggressive bodies like Glintnest Crane, but it still seems like it can be a pretty good deck. There's also some rares that fit well into this deck that are blue. Padim, Console of Innovation, is great. Giving your artifacts hexproof is awesome, especially if you have artifact creatures. That's a big problem, especially if their removal does like 3 damage and Padim just doesn't care. On top of that, if you control the artifact with the highest converted mana cost, or tied for it, you get to draw a card, and chances are you've got a good chance to do that. There's only 2 decks that really, really care about artifacts, and you have a decent chance to be drawing cards. Saheeli's Artistry also at its best here, because you're frequently going to control both an artifact and a creature, so you can make 2 copies of things. Sometimes you can just make 2 copies of an artifact creature too, if you want to. So once again, we have 2 archetypes that have sort of different goals, but they care about the same thing. They care about artifacts. And because of that, I think there is a potential 3-color deck here as well, and it is the Grixis Artifact deck. But I think of all of the 3-color shards we're talking about, after we talked about Abzan and Temur decks, the Grixis deck is going to be the hardest one to get fixing for. There is no common, I already said this, but there's no common dual lands in this format. There's no Evolving Wilds-like card. There's none of that. All we have in this format for you to fix if you're not a green deck is Prophetic Prism and Aether Hub. And that's not so good. I think for this deck to work, you have to be lucky and open up a Spire Bluff Canal or 2, and you should probably be taking them pretty highly if you feel like the Grixis Artifact deck is like you have strong cards for it. Taking a Spire Bluff Canal early isn't a bad idea. Aether Hub is fine, but it's not incredible in this deck. This deck, while it could produce energy, if it's doing what it really wants to do, it's caring more about artifacts than energy. And because of that, Aether Hub's not awesome. The Prism's actually really good in this deck. That's one thing the deck has going for it is, of all the decks in the format, of all the 3 shards in the format, it wants Prophetic Prism the most. A, because it doesn't have green, and B, because the deck wants to have artifacts in play. So again, doing 3 colors is the most powerful here because you get so many more artifact synergies by dipping into 3 colors. But here it's not going to be as easy to make work because you don't have green as one of your colors. So that does it for the first 7 archetypes, of which there's 3 sort of shards. We had Temur, we had Grixis, and we also had Abzan. The other 3 archetypes don't overlap like that. They're all individual archetypes with their own sort of identity, and they don't really need to be played with other colors at all. So let's go ahead and jump into the first of those. First off, we have Cloudblazer, a 5-mana 2/2 with flying, who, when it enters the battlefield, gains you 2 life and draws 2 cards, which is incredible. This one, I am also partial to creatures with flying and creatures that draw me cards, I have to admit. But this is another one that I would consider first picking sometimes if the pack is uninteresting other than the Cloudblazer, because it's just so good. It's just amazingly good. When I first saw this card, I thought, well, they're just going to go with blue-white skies again. They're not going to do anything interesting. But I was wrong. What Cloudblazer is trying to tell us is that we should be attempting as many times as possible to use her Enter the Battlefield ability. And that's what we want to be doing. This deck is all about blinking and bouncing your creatures, your good creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities, and doing what you can with them over and over again. So think about triggering Cloud Blazer even just twice in a game is backbreaking for an opponent. Like, you have gained 4 cards. I mean, I guess you used 1, so you gained 3 cards, and you draw, and you gained 4 life, and you still have a 2/2 flyer. Like, that's really hard for an opponent to come back from, assuming you're drawing even decently with those extra cards you're drawing. And that's what this deck wants to do. This deck has several ways of blinking things. Let's talk about those first before we talk about other creatures with enter the battlefield abilities. One of them is Acrobatic Maneuver. It lets you exile a creature and returns it to the battlefield under its owner's control, which means yours. And it's interesting that it says, creature you control, return it to the battlefield under its owner's... Oh, well, I guess if someone steals your creature... If you have a stolen creature, you don't want to use Acrobatic Maneuver on it. But anyway, Acrobatic Maneuver blinks something, draws you a card as well, so it replaces itself. So that's pretty awesome. And the nice thing about these blink cards too is you can use them in response to removal, and that's when it's really backbreaking. If your opponent is like trying to kill your creature with an enter the battlefield ability, and you go Acrobatic Maneuver, you just killed the card they played, Acrobatic Maneuver replaces itself, and you get an enter the battlefield trigger. And that's going to come up in this format. I have to say, it's going to come up in this format because that's what this archetype is about. Another card that fits well here is Disappearing Act. 3 mana to counter a spell, that's cancel, big deal. But what seems like a downside isn't much of a downside in this deck, because you can return a permanent you control to your hand, and if it's something that has an enter the battlefield ability, you get another trigger after your Disappearing Act also ate their card. So that's a pretty good deal. There is also Aviary Mechanic, 2 mana, 2/2. Most decks will find it with it if they need some low curve guys. But in this deck, it has an extra upside in that you can return any permanent you control to its owner's hand, which means you can return a creature who has a good enter the battlefield ability to your hand, and then play it again to get the trigger, the beneficial trigger. There is also Wispweaver Angel, who is the only card so far in this list that I think is a decently high pick for basically every deck, because she has a reasonable body and a decent ability that actually is relevant in more than just a blue-white deck, but it's the best here. So that's something to keep in mind. Whereas I think Acrobatic Maneuver, nobody wants that card unless you're in this deck. So that's something to keep in mind. If you see them around, the deck is open, and it's a very strong card in this deck, not very good in any other deck. Disappearing Act is basically the same thing. Aviary Mechanic, also playable in most decks just because it's a 2 mana 2/2, and Wispweaver Angel because it has a reasonable body as well. And there's also Aether Trade Winds, a card that lets you get extra value because you bounce your opponent's permanent and your own, but the one you're bouncing ideally has an enter the battlefield trigger. So that's what's the fun thing to do with Aether Trade Winds. And there's also one artifact that helps you out here in a couple different ways. First of all, it can produce a ton of energy for you if you find you need some energy. In addition to that, it can return creatures to your hand. So you can get triggers again on your enter the battlefield ability creatures if you return them to your hand, obviously. So let's look at the cards with enter the battlefield abilities that make this deck run, to make the cards like Acrobatic Maneuver, normally a very subpar card, actually playable. We have Console Shield Guard. Basically, any of the creatures who produce energy are actually pretty solid in this deck, because if after you run out of their energy and you have a card that bounces one of them or blinks one of them, you get more energy, and then you can use their ability again. So Console Shield Guard can use energy, and it can use it to make things indestructible. So this is basically the deck for the white cards that care about energy, because there's not really a white energy deck, but there's this deck which can use energy and abuse energy by making sure the creatures who make it make even more. Similarly, Eddy Trailhawk, a 2 mana 1/2 with flying, gives you energy, and when it attacks, you can give another creature flying, which is usually a pretty strong effect. And once you run out of energy, if you don't have anything better to use it on, I will say most of the time it's not the best idea to be blinking your Eddy Trailhawks or your Console Shield Guards, but if you don't have another choice and for example, it can win you the game, obviously you should do it. So it gives you the extra energy to give more creatures flying. Thriving Ibex, kind of underwhelming comparatively to what we've just looked at, but the bad news about it is basically all it's doing is producing you more energy. When you blink it, it's going to lose its counters, so it's not amazing, but if you have a reason to want energy, it's not bad. Aether Theorist, we've seen him before. Basically, you can just keep scrying if you want to, and this is the kind of deck that is a little bit controlling and can be just scrying forever if it wants to. High Tide Hermit, not amazing, but fine. If you end up having to run the guy, he's okay in this deck because you can always make sure he has energy to bash people with. Janjeet Sentry is also good in this deck because you get extra energy and you can use it to tap down things so that your guys can attack. And Minister of Inquiries again. This might also be a deck where you can occasionally mill someone to death. There's also Thriving Turtle, has the same problem as Thriving Ibex though. So this is not by any means all of the Blink creatures. These are just the energy ones. I think the ones that are the best for the deck are probably just Console Shield Guard and Eddy Trailhawk. But the others are all fine, except maybe the Ibex and Thriving Turtle are not incredibly exciting. But now let's look at other creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities. So while the green-white deck wants Fabricate the most, this deck also doesn't mind it. It can make extra tokens. It can help this deck go wide. And sometimes this deck might have the ability to go wide enough to actually want Inspiring Charge, but usually that's for green-white. So anything with Fabricate is good in the deck because it helps you go wide. These are all guys we've seen before. A card that's really sweet for this deck and that I'm looking forward to playing, and that's another indicator that the deck is probably open, is Ninth Bridge Patrol. He himself doesn't have an Enter the Battlefield ability, but anytime a creature leaves the battlefield that you control, he gets a +1/+1 counter. Now, at first it's like, well, it's just Unruly Mob, right? Because if you don't pay attention to that, it says leaves the battlefield, which I didn't the first time I read it. But it does. It says leaves the battlefield. So every time you blink something, every time you bounce something, he gets bigger, as well as getting bigger when your opponents kill your creatures. So he's pretty sweet in the deck. You can even set up some pretty gross combos where you have like your Wispweaver Angel bounce the 2-mana guy who bounces another of your cards, and then he gains like 3 power in 1 turn. I mean, there's going to be some cool things to do with him. And if you can't tell, this is the archetype I think I'm most excited for in the format, just because it seems the most interesting to me. We also have Herald of the Fair, not the most exciting, but it can make something bigger for a turn. Something that is exciting, and perhaps one of the best things to do with blinking at common or uncommon, is Experimental Aviator, who can just make an army of Thopter tokens. And the Thopter tokens are much better than Servo tokens because they fly. And even if you just bounce Experimental Aviator once, you have an army of Thopters that can quickly kill an opponent. We've also got Glint Nest Crane, who we've seen before, who, if you blink it, can help you draw some more cards if you need to. There's also Nimble Innovator, who can draw you extra cards if you blink it, which is something that this deck wants to be doing, I think. There's also a vehicle that allows you, that likes to be bounced because it also draws you a card. So that's something that's nice. And there's, the less exciting Filigree Familiar. Gaining you life is fine, but not overly exciting. I think the best things you want to be doing with this deck are blinking like Visionary Augmenter and Experimental Aviator, because they can just build you up armies. In addition to Nibble Innovator and obviously the gold card for this color pair obviously also loves to get bounced. So let's look at a few cards that are really good in this deck that are rare. Well, Aetherstorm Rock is basically made for this deck. He gets energy whenever it or another creature enters the battlefield under your control. So if you're bouncing things, he gets extra energy. Then when he attacks, he can tap things down and make himself bigger. Cataclysmic Gearhulk, as well as Torrential Gearhulk, who I don't have here, are both amazing cards anyway, but man, in this deck are they abusive, because you can start blinking your Gearhulks and your opponent. That's probably one of the most broken things you can do in the format, is blink your Cataclysmic or Torrential Gearhulk. It's not a nice thing to do to people, but it's very strong. So Aether Squall Ancient is nice for a couple reasons. The energy can be nice sometimes, but most importantly, after he makes enough energy, he can bounce all creatures to their owner's hands, except itself, which means you get in for 6 for one thing. But for another thing, that's going to hurt your opponent more frequently, more than it will hurt you, because you'll have effects that let you use Enter the Battlefield triggers. Now, this works less well if you have a lot of Fabricate in your deck, because obviously you lose the tokens, but it works well with the other cards. And then Paradoxical Outcome is kind of like the dream card to have in this deck. I'm not sure if it's actually going to be playable in this deck, I should say. But man, doesn't it seem fun to return a bunch of creatures with Enter the Battlefield triggers, draw a bunch of extra cards at the end of your opponent's turn, and then just replay a couple of them and get their effects again. I think it sounds fun. I'm going to try it at some point. I'll let you know whether it's playable. But the other 3 definitely are, as well as Torrential Gearhulk. So that's the blue-white blink deck. Seems like a lot of fun. Let's move on to another archetype. So our next archetype is red-white, our next color pair, and the archetype for it seems to be vehicles. Our signpost uncommon here is Veteran Motorist, a pretty efficiently costed 2-mana 3/1 who also scries you 2. That alone would be a pretty strong card. But he also loves vehicles. He's a pilot, and whenever Veteran Motorist crews a vehicle, that vehicle gets +1/+1 till end of turn. So this deck tries to lean towards vehicles. So let's see what what some of the other payoffs are for vehicles in red and white. So you have Speedway Fanatic, 2 mana, 2/1 with haste, and when you cruise a vehicle, that vehicle gains haste until end of turn. So pretty solid. Most of the vehicles you can't crew right away. Speedway Fanatic obviously really good with like cards with crew too, because it can just immediately crew them, and then all of a sudden you're smashing with a brand new vehicle. There's also Start Your Engines, which is I think a key card for this deck, because if you just have like one vehicle in play, even using Start Your Engines is pretty gross. Like if you have two, it's even better. But one vehicle in play to Start Your Engines is pretty amazing. And this is the best deck for vehicles, and so this is the deck to play it in. And there's also Gear Shift Ace, which I think is actually better than Speedway Fanatic. I think giving first strike to some of these artifacts, to some of these vehicles, is actually really good, as is haste. But I think first strike's even better. So that's pretty nice. A 2 mana 2/1 with first strike on its own is also better than a 2 mana 2/1 with haste. So poor Speedway Fanatic is a little lower on the totem pole, but they're both cards that pay you off for playing vehicles. There's also a few other cards that I think are at their best in vehicle decks. Trusty Companion is a 2 mana creature with 3 power. That means it can crew up things up to crew 3. So basically any creature with a pretty good power cost to mana ratio, mana cost to power ratio is a pretty good thing to have. And Trusty Companion allows you to crew things. Kind of a subtle thing about it too is that it can attack if you're attacking with something else and not the vehicle on your turn, and then it can be untapped and crew a vehicle to block for you if that ever comes up. I don't know if it will. Quicksmith Genius is good in a lot of decks, but I like that he has 3 power, crew 3 and below are the most frequent crew costs, and being able to loot for you is nice. And Spireside Infiltrator's clearly there for the vehicle decks, because anytime it becomes tapped, which means when it attacks or when it crews a vehicle, it does 1 damage to each opponent. So that's a nice little card to have in your vehicle deck. Now let's look at some of the actual vehicles. This, unlike most of the other things I've done in this review of the archetypes, this is going to be in order of how highly I would pick each of these common or uncommon vehicles. It's sort of my pick order. Obviously, all vehicles are good in this deck, but I want to point out the ones that are especially good, so I have them listed in that order. I think the best one, and I could end up being wrong because vehicles are hard to evaluate, but I think the best one might be Ovalchase Dragster. It only needs 1 crew member. It needs crew 1, I should say. Has trample, has haste, and it's a 6/1. Imagine giving that first strike. That's my dream, I guess, that I'm envisioning with the pilot who gives first strike. Ovalchase Dragster with first strike is just like, you may as well stop playing unless you can kill it, because that is a really scary thing to do. I mean, and even if you don't have that going on, you play it and you either bash for 6, or your opponent has to block with something to kill it while they also take some damage, because usually they're not going to want to have that thing swinging at them again. So it's a solid card, trades for a card, usually at least, while also getting in for some damage, and I like that. I think the best common one is the next highest pick for me, and that is Renegade Freighter. It's a 3 mana 4/3, but when it attacks, it gains trample and +1/+1 till end of turn, and it only has crew 2, so both pilots are good with it, as well as the fact that it's just a really efficiently costed artifact. You want artifacts in general in this format, and it also matters that it's a lower on the curve than most of the other things we're going to talk about here. Playing it on turn 3 while you have one of your pilots in play isn't that hard to do. Ballista Charger is next on my list. It has crew 3, a little harder to crew, but the ability to ping a creature or a player every time it attacks is good, and a 6/6 body isn't something to be sad about either. Bomat Bazaar Barge is nice too, just because it draws you a card. I mean, not just because, it also happens to be a beater, a 5/5 beater, and it has crew 3, which I don't mind. That's a little higher. You know, we have a 6/6 with crew 3, and a 5/4 trampler with crew 2, but the fact that it draws you a card makes it pretty good. Aradara Express is also pretty good. It has crew 4, but man, if you can crew this thing, huh? Again, if you give this guy first strike or haste, both are pretty scary. Those are pretty good. So I think these 5 are the ones that I would like the most. I'd also like to point out that even though this is a vehicle deck, I think it gets dangerous to play more than 4 or 5 vehicles in it, because if you just don't have a good creature to vehicle ratio, you won't be able to crew them. So don't just be like taking all the vehicles, because they don't work very well in large numbers. You need to have some creatures as well. So 4 or 5 is plenty, and you'll hit your vehicles often enough for your vehicle synergies to matter. And these are, like I said, these are the 5 that I think are the ones that I would be happiest, let's say, to have in my deck. The next 2 are also fine. I think they're both playable. At least the first one is, but I don't like them nearly as much. So we have Sky Skiff. It's fine, 2 mana, 2/3 with flying. Crew 1, easy to crew. That part's nice, but it just doesn't compared to the mana cost for the other vehicles, it's just not that impressive because the others are just so huge. You're paying 5 for an 8/6 mana Menace. Menace is hard to say for Aradara Express. I mean, that's crazy. 2 mana for a 2/3 flyer. Yeah, that's a little bit of a boost over what we're used to, but not crazy by any stretch. And then the one that I think is borderline unplayable is Demolition Stomper. It is huge, yes, but it doesn't actually have that good of an invasive ability. You can block it easily. You can just chump it if you need to, although you can't chump it with the servo token, so it has that going for it. But its crew cost is also incredibly high, so I don't love it. Maybe borderline unplayable is too strong. I could be proven wrong. Again, vehicle's hard to evaluate, but I definitely like the other ones more at this point. I could see it maybe sliding up to where Ardara Express is, but not much farther than that. So let's look at the rares that fit best into this deck, some of which are vehicles, one of which is another pilot. She gives your other dwarves +1/+1 as well, and there are a lot of dwarves in red and white anyway, well, mostly in white, that she works well with. She also pumps all your vehicles, and if that's not enough, when she crews something or becomes tapped, you get to pay X, and you can reveal a top X card to your library and put a dwarf or a vehicle into your hand. So that's pretty great. She's pretty amazing. If you're in this deck, she's like one of the dream rares to get. Cultivator's Caravan, nice as well. Helps you fix, which isn't the easiest thing to do, while also just being a mana rock that can kill people. Fleetwheel Cruiser is really sweet. I think it's actually a decently high pick in the format because it gives you a 4 mana 5/3 trample and haste. Doesn't need to be crewed the time turn it comes into play. It's not going to be hard to get in for 5 or 8 damage with the thing and trade for a card. And then Sky Sovereign Console Flagship, I think, is one of the biggest bombs in the format. It's a 5 mana 6/5 of flying, lightning bolts when it comes into play, and does it every time it swings as well. So some sweet cards. The vehicle deck seems fun. It's not really something we've seen before. But again, I guess the biggest thing I'm going to stress again is to say don't play more than like 4 to 6 vehicles, because then you're going to be running into some problems. You have to have, if you're running 4 to 6 vehicles, that means you have to have like 16 creatures, which means you have barely any space for like removal. So that's not really what you want to be doing. But anyway, let's go ahead and move on to our final archetype, which is black-white. And it's a graveyard deck. Our signpost uncommon is Restoration Gearsmith. For 4 mana, she gives you an artifact or creature back from your graveyard. And she's pretty good. She's basically a much better Gravedigger. And that's not a bad thing to have. She has 1 more power and 1 more toughness, and she can get back artifacts as well as creatures. But I think this archetype is unfortunately the least supported of all of them. You have only 3 cards at common or uncommon that really support this, and one of them's bad. Refurbish is nice. It would be a really cool world to live in where you can draft like a deck where you cast Refurbish to get back a ridiculously costed artifact. And that deck might come together every now and again, but it's not going to happen that often. Drakara Scavenger is pretty bad. I don't know why they put it on top of your library. I mean, 6 for a 4/6 already isn't the best rate, and then you don't get it in your hand right away, so you aren't really drawing a card. You're setting up your next draw. I think it would have been a reasonable card to be a 6 mana 4/6 that gets you a card actually into your hand. Fortuitous Find is also actually pretty good. If you run a lot of artifacts and a lot of creatures, it draws you 2 cards from your graveyard. Unfortunately, though, that's basically all this deck has. And so black-white, there's always one archetype that is the most under-supported, and this time around it appears to be black-white. It's hard to support 10 color pairs, I guess. That seems to usually be the case. Black-white I feel bad for, though, because it's been kind of a dud of a archetype in the last block as well, where it was sort of a token deck, sort of a graveyard value deck. It's not to say black-white decks can't be good. It's just to say they're not going to be synergistic like some of the other decks are. One thing black-white does have going on that I didn't mention here, though, is that it has Fabricate. So you can occasionally end up with a black-white Fabricate deck that can go wide effectively, but it's going to have access to less ways of taking advantage of going wide. And there aren't quite as many creatures with Fabricate in black either as there are in green. So it's kind of just going to be a good stuff deck. It allows some Fabricate stuff going on, some artifact stuff going on, a little bit of graveyard value. It can be a good deck. Black-white could be a good deck in Shadows over Innistrad block. It just wasn't the most interesting synergistic deck of them all. It was just sort of like, look, I have good removal and I have some good creatures, so I think I'll probably win. And that's kind of what black-white will be in this set too. So that does it. We made it through all of the archetypes, all of the color pairs. That does it for this archetype review. If you found this video useful, don't forget to click the like button. If you have any questions about the format, if you have any questions about cards I might have left out or included, post them in the comments below. And if you want to make sure that you catch an archetype video like this, as well as other limited review videos every time a new set comes out, including a couple more videos about Kaladesh, don't forget to click subscribe. Thanks for watching.